a chart, you can make a chart. This is scribble, so you might want to take a picture of it after. Maybe that'd be easier. What we're going to do today is I'm going to roll through all 13 colonies. It's going to be like crash course, the 13 colonies, what you need to know. And if you want to open up AMSCO, page 76 has everything you need to study. So this page 76 has everything you need to study from topic 2.3.
Kufs, neon pink looks really good on you.
Oh,
Yes.
thank you.
Wait, didn't she already say that?
Real men wear pink.
Thank you. Oh.
76
That's
page.
why I wear blue.
Page.
So listen, everybody's got that open. Let's start right here. We're going to start with New England. First of all, why do we call it New England, do you think?
Because
It's
it's
region.
New England.
It's a New England, and most of, if not all of, the settlers at this point are coming from England to this area. The first settlers landed on a rock at
Plymouth.
Plymouth in 1620.
Yes.
They were a group of people who came on a ship called the
Mayflower.
Mayflower. And this group of people were known as pilgrims. Well, no, the Puritans come later. They want to purify the church. The original are the separatists, the pilgrims. The king of England doesn't want the pilgrims in England. And the reason England doesn't want the pilgrims in England is because their views are seen as radical to the Church of England. So they're sort of banished. They go to Holland. They think they're going to Jamestown. They end up north at Plymouth Rock. They struggle. You know, they have a Mayflower Compact on the ship. They struggle with the natives. They end up having the first Thanksgiving the next year, which becomes famous. But ultimately, what you need to know about Plymouth is the significance of the Mayflower Compact and the fact that it's really the second English colony in the New World. And 10 years later, the Puritans, Kendra said it, the Puritans join. And where are the Puritans coming from? England. Why? Same reason. They want to purify the Church of England. What does the British rule say? No, get out. And essentially, what ends up happening, they come to north of Plymouth to where? Massachusetts Bay, which is what city?
Boston.
Boston, Massachusetts. Eventually, Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay become the colony of Massachusetts. The motive is religious freedom. That's why people came there. Much different than Jamestown that we talked about yesterday, right? What was the reason people came to Jamestown? It wasn't because of religious freedom. It was more to find what?
Money.
Money, fortune. And what did they end up finding? Tobacco ends up being the cash crop. So we talked about who was the leader of the Great Migration, the man that we introduced yesterday. Who was that guy that presidents Reagan, Obama, Bush, all these presidents spoke about him? John Winthrop. You said it back there. John Winthrop had a vision of a shining city on a hill. Ah! He wanted America to be a model of Christian charity. He really wanted America to be a beacon of light and hope to the world. And this was his vision. And that's why 400 years later, American presidents reference to John Winthrop, because they see his words as an ideal that we've taken 400 years to meet. Okay? John Winthrop, shining city on a hill. Ironically, or hypocritically, the Puritans were not tolerant of others. They were very intolerant. You know what tolerance means, right? I don't have to ask Alexa that. The Puritans are not tolerant. They're so intolerant that other colonies are formed because of their intolerance. Two of them in particular. Rhode Island. So let's write down for Rhode Island Roger Williams, the second American name that you really need to know. Roger Williams is a respected minister who kind of goes against the teachings of the Puritans, and he kind of has to get out. He founds his Holy Providence, which will become the biggest city in Rhode Island, and gets this tiny little place called Rhode Island to be his colony of his own. He wants Rhode Island to be tolerant. Tolerant of others that have dissenting viewpoints to the Puritans, because the Puritans are so rigid. So he welcomes Quakers, who we'll talk about later, even Jews. Even the Jews. He's going to welcome others that the Puritans would never welcome. If you want to know, and this is just one instance, but I mean, the Puritans are the people responsible for the Salem witch trials. I mean, just to put in perspective how intolerant the Puritans were. They were so rigid. And if you didn't fit into what their ideas were, like Anne Hutchinson, they banished you. Anne Hutchinson was a woman who believed that your faith alone could get you into heaven, and that you didn't have to like follow some code that the religious leaders said you had to. That got her banished. She ended up getting killed by American Indians down in Long Island. But Anne Hutchinson's just an example of someone that was banished and ended up in Rhode Island. And, you know, somebody that ultimately, Rhode Island becomes this safe haven for other religions. It becomes tolerant. Okay? Connecticut. The Reverend Thomas Hooker founds Connecticut, another reverend. He also left Massachusetts and he ends up in Hartford, and it merges with another. If you look, and if you've got AMSCO handy, you know, and you don't have to like, I'm not looking for you to memorize all this stuff at this point, but it gets into a little detail about Connecticut, about John Davenport founding New Haven. New Haven and Hartford merge and become the colony of Connecticut. Ultimately, Connecticut is really, as far as what you need to know, remember I told you the word precedent? The precedent set in Connecticut is that Connecticut is the place that gives us the fundamental orders of Connecticut, which is the first written constitution. What's the significance of that? The first written constitution? Well, think about what the significance is. We are a constitutional government. This is our rule book today. The first constitution comes from Thomas Hooker in Connecticut. So there's a precedent in Connecticut. New Hampshire was really just the king of England feeling like Massachusetts was too big. And so they split a little and created New Hampshire to have better control. That's all you need to know. You don't even need to know anything about New Hampshire. These four are called the New England colonies. Do we still refer to this region as New England? Duh, if you're a football fan, you know that. Today, it's those four states with Vermont and Maine. But those are the four New England colonies. Let's talk about some characteristics that you must know. And by the way, I'm going to pop quiz you on this. I might even give you a blank chart or ask you some fill in the blanks on Monday or Tuesday, probably Tuesday. So you better know this stuff either through taking notes or studying the chart there or listening to me or whatever, watching this video if I post it. Rocky soil, short growing season, so this leads to shipbuilding, lumber, and fishing because of the coastline. Those become chief crops. The people in this region are predominantly English. The religions of the Puritans, really the beginning of the Baptist faith in colonial America, and a lot of dissenters. That's New England in a nutshell. Let's move to the middle. We're standing in the middle colony right now, aren't we? Which one?
New York.
New York. New York was originally what? Dutch.
Yes.
Dutch. New York was originally called
New Amsterdam.
New Amsterdam. It was settled by Henry Hudson in the Hudson River Valley, by Peter Minuet in Manhattan. These are Dutch settlers. It has a Dutch history. How does it become an English colony? Well, in the 1660s, the king decided he wanted New York. It was a good region that was in between New England and Virginia. And so he ends up talking the Dutch into giving him New York. And he changes the name and names it after the Duke of York from New Amsterdam. So New York becomes an important royal colony. All these colonies are royal colonies except for the two that I'm going to tell you are not. That means that they're ruled directly by the crown, but the crown puts leaders like a royal governor here. You follow me? Let's talk about Pennsylvania. First of all, the leader of Pennsylvania, this is not a royal colony, this has a leader. The leader of Pennsylvania, you've been looking at him your whole life, and you didn't even know it. Here he is.
Isn't it like William Penn?
That's William Penn.
Yep.
You've been staring at him his whole life. There he is. Who the heck is he? Well, he's the Quaker. Who are the Quakers? Well, much like the Puritans, okay, the Quakers, much like the Puritans, go back to the whiteboard, much like the Puritans, the Quakers are not really welcomed as a Protestant religion by the Church of England and the Crown in England. But unlike the Puritans, they're not like banishing them and persecuting them. It's more of a, this word wasn't really in existence then in this context, but it's more of a, you people are really weird and we'd prefer it if you went somewhere else. The Quakers had a different look, and honestly, they were very progressive for their time. If you know anything about hippies in the United States in the 1960s, do you? They're like the hippies without the rock and roll, without the free love and sex, without the drugs. So what's left? Pacifism. You know what being a pacifist is? They don't want war. Like the Quakers refused to join and fight in the British military, which obviously upsets the Crown. The Quakers don't believe in war or violence. The Quakers are all about love. That's why I drew a really awful heart. Somebody in the other class said they'd give it a 5 or 6 out of 10. It's not my best heart. The Quakers loved you, which they named their biggest city, Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, it was called, because the Quakers were a faith of love. I got to tell you something. It's funny because Philadelphia is notorious, their sports fans in the last 50 years of being really like nasty and not loving. So, you know, they booed Santa Claus there. They're the ones that cheer when the cowboy Michael Irvin had his career-ending injury. They sort of cheered that he got hurt. They're not the nicest fans. But yeah, that's the Quaker tradition. And you know the word Quaker. You know, there used to be the restaurant in Beeville, Quaker Steak and Lube. Pennsylvania's called the Quaker State, Quaker Oats. All that Quaker stuff goes back to the Quaker faith, and this goes back to colonial America. The Quakers settled in Pennsylvania. William Penn's father was a close friend of the king. The Penn family was influential, and Penn was sort of the most high-profile Quaker. So the King of England said, I'm going to give you land. You do what you got to do in the New World. It's yours. And he named it Penn's Woods, which Pennsylvania means Penn's Woods. So William Penn becomes the proprietor. He sort of runs Pennsylvania. And he runs it under this model where he's going to do some things that are really progressive. You ready for this? Pennsylvania is going to not take Indian land without giving real compensation. So he's not going to take land from the American Indians unless he gives them real financial compensation. He's going to cooperate with American Indians. He doesn't want to war with them. He wants to get along with them. He treats them as equals. He also does a really good job of gridding cities like Philadelphia, which was a model that other places copied. But the most important thing is that the Quakers are a faith of tolerance and love. They advertise in Europe for other settlers to come there, not just English. So what you see is, you ready for this? Dutch, Swedes, French Huguenots, Germanic people come to Pennsylvania because they're recruited by the Penn family to live there. So the most ethnically diverse of the New England, Middle, and Southern colonies, you know what that means, ethnically diverse, is the middle. And in large part, that's because of Pennsylvania and Delaware, which was an offshoot of Pennsylvania. You don't need to know much about New Jersey. I like The Sopranos, though. That was about bad. reference. There's a lot more to New Jersey than The Sopranos in taping this. Anyway, these are the people. They were English people in the middle, but also Dutch and Swedes, Germanic and French Huguenots. It's a longer growing season. The soil here is pretty fertile compared to New England. That's why we see cash crops like grain and corn, although it's still cold in the winters here. We don't see plantations, but we do see large farms. Any questions about the middle? Okay, last thing, the South. I made a horrible attempt at drawing pictures of tobacco, a cigarette, a tobacco leaf. Art is not my thing.
Looks good, John.
Thanks. But in 1607, Jamestown was what, Kendra?
The first permanent settlement in the
First permanent
English.
English settlement in the New World. What was it, Cameron?
Jamestown was the first permanent English settlement in the New World.
What year was that, Katie? 1607. Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in the New World. Whoop-de-doo. Well, it is a whoop-de-doo. Because it's going to set a trend or a precedent that will equal 13 other colonies. Now, what did Jamestown, what was it about? Well, 60 of the first 900 people survived. Why? Variety of reasons. They didn't have expertise on how to live like that. They didn't come to serve, they didn't come with families intact. They came as a bunch of dudes. This is where John Rolfe and Pocahontas and the fictionalized movie comes from. Ultimately they came with the wrong intentions. They were looking for riches, and unfortunately the other thing that happens is this is where the slave trade really becomes this necessity. Even though that's in all the colonies, Virginia develops tobacco and realizes that tobacco is such a cash crop that even though it took 2 decades for Virginia to really survive, and by 1624, what was a joint stock company becomes a royal colony like all the others, and that helps it be more economically stable. So Jamestown becomes Virginia. And one thing that's really noteworthy is that we see examples of that America is going to be a place of self-government, much like the town hall meetings in New England. The Virginia House of Burgesses was a legislative branch precedent where we elected leaders. And we set a precedent that we would be self-governing. Virginia becomes the most important southern colony, the largest southern colony, the most influential southern colony, and as an early state, Virginia will be the birthplace of 4 of the first 5 U.S. presidents. The Virginia Dynasty. Virginia is an important voice at the Constitutional Convention and at the Continental Congress 11 years earlier for independence. The other southern colonies won't move without Virginia. So Virginia is fundamentally important. We've had a lot of famous Americans, from Patrick Henry to Chief Justice John Marshall to George Washington to Thomas Jefferson to James Madison to James Monroe. All these early Americans were all from Virginia. So Virginia is a very influential place in this period of history. The second southern colony I want to talk about, which is also in the Chesapeake region, is Maryland. Maryland is the only colony that, at least initially, is trying to attract Catholics, although Protestants will end up outnumbering them. Here's the thing, folks. I can't crash course this, because it would take me a half hour to explain, but the thing with Christianity is that it's based on Christianity, and the belief that Christ is divine. And for a long time, Christianity centered in the Roman Empire, where it spread, and that's where the Pope is. And for 1,000 years plus, Roman Catholicism is Christianity with the Pope. But you learned about Martin Luther. What you see is this Protestant Reformation and all these different S-E-C-T-S. I spelled that out because the word is sex, but it's S-E-C-T-S. All these different offshoots, like what? Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Quaker, Puritan, Congregationalist, right? Unitarian, Episcopalian. Have you heard these names now and then? All these different groups are called Protestants. And they're all not in step with the Roman Catholics. In fact, America is settled by the English and the Europeans is really Protestant. Every American president except one is Protestant. 2 now. Biden. And before that, John F. Kennedy. Oops. Every other American president was a Protestant. It's a Protestant tradition. In fact, before my dad passed away, he told me a story that I had never heard before. He owned a bar for 30 years on State Street in Auburn, which is Route 38. And he said when he bought the bar, I like taped him. He's like on his deathbed. He's telling me these stories. He owned a bar, and he said when he bought the bar, he was Protestant. My mom was Catholic, and I was raised Catholic, but he was Protestant. And he said when he owned the bar, a bunch of Catholics, guys, came down and like gave him crap about having a bar, a Protestant having a tavern in a Catholic neighborhood in Auburn. In Auburn, like who gives a crap? In 1965, like it's not like it's 1800. Like this Protestant Catholic stuff was still going on. There was still this like, even like parents would be like, you can't date a Catholic, you're a Protestant. Like this stuff still went on with religion within Christianity as recently as that. Which seems bizarre, but that's just the way that things work. You think it was bad. That's why the Irish were so hated when they came here after the potato famine. They were Roman Catholics. That's why when the Italian immigrants came here in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they like banded together because they were Catholic. They weren't wanted by a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. And this Maryland experiment is unique because Maryland is going to be, what happens is the king really respects Lord Baltimore, this guy Calvert, and he gives him Maryland. And he's letting him like have the second proprietary like owner colony, like Pennsylvania. And he dies, Lord Baltimore, and his son, Lord Baltimore too, becomes the second. He becomes the leader of this area. What ends up happening is that the Protestants outnumber the Catholics anyway, so it's sort of moot. But Maryland is, you know, they're going to be tolerant of Catholicism, which they're the only one. Even Roger Williams, he's not saying like, hey, bring some Catholics here. And he's a really tolerant place. But Maryland's going to try to be tolerant. The Carolinas, they end up getting split into North and South. South does a lot of like rice. North does a lot of tar, you know, in terms of exports. North Carolina has tobacco. South's a little too south for good tobacco, just climate-wise. And then Georgia. Georgia's the last colony. 1733, founded by a guy named James Oglethorpe. And if you did the reading like you were supposed to, Georgia served 2 purposes. 1, a buffer. You know what's a buffer? Like something to stop something. To stop Spanish attacks into the colonies. If Georgia's there, then they'll stop coming up from Florida. And the second thing is a haven where debtors are sent out of British prisons. In those days, if you didn't pay your debts, they put you in jail. Imagine if they did that now, there'd be a lot of Americans in jail. Well, they were sent to Georgia. So Georgia is sort of a place where debtors were sent. Like, hey, you got to pay your debt. The government says you owe them 10 shillings. I can't afford it. Well, then we're putting you on a ship and you're going to Georgia. Bye. Can't pay your debt, you're going to Georgia. So Georgia, named after King George, is the last colony, and it served 2 purposes. The southern colonies have long growing seasons, very fertile soil, very nice climate. Tobacco is the most important crop, and unfortunately, Africans against their will become 20% of the southern population, and then even more. Eventually, they'll be 20% of the entire colonial population by 1775. Any questions? You can stop it. Thank you. That's colonial history in a 20-minute nutshell, in a mash.